Well, good evening, everybody, and indeed welcome to this Ecclesiastical Law Society seminar. We're running the seminar on the subject of the new faculty jurisdiction around carbon zero, which is quite challenging in many ways. And one of the things that we like to do in these training sessions is not just to inform people about the law, but also to engage in some of the practical issues as well. So we've got a range of people who are going to help us with that. So at this point, I'm going to ask my colleagues, after I've introduced myself, to introduce themselves in the order in which you will actually hear them across our time this early evening. So my name's Simon Baker. I'm a retired archdeacon, and I've been chairing the ELS training group for probably 3 or 4 years by now. It might even be longer than that, and we've covered quite a lot of topics together. I'm also currently the member of the DAC in the Diocese of Bath and Wells, and I was chair of the DAC in the Diocese of Lichfield, and a parish priest at the same time. So have all kinds of feet in all kinds of camps in terms of experience of how some of these issues get worked through. So can I ask my colleagues to introduce themselves in the order in which we're going to hear from them?
So I think that's me. Hello, everybody. My name's Andrea Russell. I'm also a priest. For the last 10 years or so, I've been a theological educator. At the moment, as of about 3 weeks ago, I'm the warden of Gladstone's Library. So thinking very much here about what does divine learning mean in different sort of places. So when you said, Simon, we're thinking about rules and practical things, I'm probably doing neither. I'm doing the theology bit, which we're going to have to think about whether that's at all practical. So.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Louise Kershaw. I'm the Registrar of the Province of York and also the Registrar of the Diocese of York and the Registrar of the Diocese of Soder and Man. And certainly in my capacity as Registrar of the Diocese of York, I do attend the DAC meetings, so I'm aware of some of the concerns, and I'm also a PCC member in my own diocese. So these matters are all of interest to me, and I'll be talking you through the legal side of things.
Thank you.
I'm Norman Berks, and I'm retired priest now. I help out in the local parish here in Southampton, and for a number of years I've been secretary of the ELS training group.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just a few words then about how we're going to run this evening. If you've got any issues, Russell will keep his eye open for anybody who accidentally or leaves the seminar but needs to be readmitted. And if you've got any issues, please put something in the chat if you need any help, and he will be looking at that. The way the program's going to work this evening is we're going to have 2 presentations, and then we're going to have a comfort, get yourself a cup of tea break for about 10 minutes. Now, experience of the past shows that actually people sometimes just stay for the first half and don't necessarily stay for the second. That's fine. If that's what you'd like to do, no problems. You'll perhaps be aware already that we're recording the first half and we're not going to record the second half. If you want to stay on for the whole thing, we're going to be divided into breakout groups, and the breakout groups really are a chance not only to discuss what you've heard from the speakers this evening, but also actually to share your questions, your concerns, your issues, parts of your story in terms of how some of this carbon zero challenge is actually impacting on you in whatever role you happen to be in. And I think one of the important things perhaps about this evening is hearing from each other, learning from each other, and being supported by the fact that there are other people wrestling with these issues and trying to take things forward. So the discussions are going to be, I hope, very informative and interesting. And then we're just going to end with a general question and answer at the end of the evening. And we will end promptly by 6 o'clock, if not slightly before. So I think that's probably enough about starting. We need to get into the first session, and our first session is really thinking about theology. One of the things that I've experienced, and perhaps we all have, is that when you are talking about issues like carbon zero or other really quite tough problems, when we're in PCCs or in Darson synods or deanery synods, or even perhaps in general synod, though I've never been there, thank goodness, we perhaps tend to talk initially about the practicalities, the difficulties, the issues. How do we achieve this? Perhaps we talk first about money and the affordability of these things. And it's very easy for theology and our understanding of God to disappear and really not be the first thing that we engage with. Now, as part of our training that we do with the ELS, we like to actually make sure that we keep the law in its proper context as part of the life of the people of God. And therefore, we believe that theology is actually a really important thing. And we hope that the conversation that I'm going to have with Andrea in a few moments will inform the kinds of conversation that you may be leading or encouraging in your own context. Because unless we're able to do some of that, some of the decisions we make may not be well done, and people won't necessarily see the breadth of it all. Having said that, your context is incredibly important, and I think that's probably something we're going to emphasize as we go along. So for me, theology is important. I hope it is for nearly all of us who are here, if not all of us. It's our springboard. It's about how we do things in the light of our understanding of God and who we are in relationship to each other within that understanding of God. So, Andrea, why is the theological aspect important to you?
I think you've kind of said it all, haven't you, Simon, really? I mean, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because one of the fabulous bits of the stuff that we do through ELS is that idea that we can so easily separate out the practical stuff that we do, the rules that we do, the canons, as if somehow that's not also about who is God and who are we as the people of God. So one of the things we've been really keen on as a team, isn't it, is to, as you say, is to weave those things together. So we know, don't we, that our view of God and our view of each other as the people of God and how we understand things in this particular area to do with, well, so how do we understand the doctrine of creation? And we're using words like theology as well. We could just talk about, well, how do we understand the scriptures? How do we understand God? What has the tradition said to us? How do we understand it now? And so it seems to me to be really important because it means that we don't immediately rush to outcomes. We sit and talk about this in a way that is about worship and prayer and about mission, and then we talk about how that does sort of lives out. So,
what for you would be perhaps one of the key scriptures to begin with, because our theology should always be rooted in Scripture.
Yeah, and this is where we bump into a few thorny bits, don't we? Because many of us now look at this and say, of course we want to not plunder the world. Of course we want to care for what we have. Of course we see ourselves as being intimately entwined in creation. But if we look back at Christian history and we look back at the scriptures, sometimes that's a little bit hazier or not interpreted in the way that we do now. So often people will go back to Genesis, that absolutely beautiful opening chapters of Genesis, which are just big picture thinking, creating this beautiful picture of God creating us out of nothing and so forth. But we get to that tricky little verse in Genesis 1:28 that talks about God giving us dominion over the world. And sadly, and we've chatted about this, Simon, sadly sometimes we've seen dominion as more power to do what we wish, almost to plunder, rather than the power to be responsible and to care for. And therefore this can be a bit of a tension, I think.
Yeah. And I think we could also say that perhaps that attitude towards creation is something that's very deep in our culture, particularly in Western culture. Whether you want to label it as capitalist or whatever, we, all of us, benefit from the fact that nature has been exploited on our behalf. And one of the things that perhaps is quite striking about COP22 is the voices we're now hearing from the developing world. And that immediately raises questions about how it is that we are where we are and they are where they are. And again, perhaps that's another aspect of our theology, which is that we are called to have a responsibility for other people, whether they are our immediate neighbours or not.
So so we're tying in, aren't we, that idea about dominion, meaning we do have certain power, but actually we need to use that power for good and responsibly, and that's not just to the material world, that's to each other. And that brings us back to that other bit, doesn't it, Simon, that sort of runs in tension in the tradition, which is we've often, as Christians, sounded as if we're more concerned about the spirit, about the soul, about what happens to us when we die, rather than about the world we live in now. And therefore there's always been this sort of tension between, well, actually the body isn't, the body's to be subdued. It can be sometimes looked at as not very nice. It's the flesh, it's all that's horrible. And we start to think of the world like that as well, the world around us. But what really matters is the life of the spirit. And what has been fab has been, over the last 20, 30 years, people like Tom Wright drawing out of this. So you've got Francis of Assisi from wherever. Sorry, I've realised when I'm on Zoom, I do talk with my hands a lot.
It's a visual medium, you carry on.
but it's that idea that actually we've always had in tradition an idea that actually bodies do matter. That the incarnation itself says these bodies matter, and therefore the fact that the world around us matters, and how we live that out is, as Christians, is not just about what happens to my soul when I die.
I think that whole thing about the sense of us being enfleshed and, that's what makes us who we are, does stand a little in contrast to perhaps some of the Western tradition deriving from people like Descartes, the sense of, the mind being very separate from the body. Much more in the Hebrew tradition, as I understand it, we are integrated wholes. And we're not just integrated in ourselves, we are integrally part of the creation. And that seems to me to be a very fundamental thing. As we were thinking about this earlier, one of the things that struck me, though, was, and you've mentioned Genesis 1 quite rightly, is the parable of the talents, which we hear regularly, and we preach about, those of us who are privileged to preach. And I wonder whether it's played quite a significant but kind of rather hidden role in the attitudes we've had about exploiting the world, because it almost invites us not to leave things alone. But to kind of multiply and accrue and gain and, in a sense, offer back to God things that have actually been multiplied. In other words, to take the raw material and to make it into other things. You could almost say that it's the parable that's the root of manufacture. And so, in a way, perhaps we have to reconsider some of even of the most familiar scriptures that we've been living with, because in the scripture, it's not enough just to hand back exactly what we've been given. It has to be more than. And so I've been wondering whether, in a sense, our Protestant heritage particularly is about our impetus to do and to make and to act, and that actually needs to be looked at again. I've always been concerned.
Oh, Simon! I'm getting all excited. so we hadn't quite talked on this, have we? So you're throwing something in here. You mentioned that before, but really excited as you were talking, thinking about, so when in Genesis God says, go forth and multiply, be fruitful. Again, that can sometimes be interpreted as an idea that somehow we will now take over. That somehow this is about power, this is about we're going to fill this space. Whereas if you then read that in line with the parable of the talents that you're talking about, is there something in there about human beings flourishing in their giftedness, being all that we are called to be, And therefore that's not about being in the space and I'm boss. That's somehow about making sure the space for us all to grow and develop, all of us. So brings us back to that idea about you said about the imbalance within the world. And again, if we start to read some of these scriptures in the light, not simply, you know, of power, but empowerment, all of us to each other, then it starts to be quite a different slant, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I think one of the things that we perhaps need to say is that what we're thinking about carbon neutral, carbon zero, actually has some real impacts on what we do as individuals. I mean, we are brought up in a very consumer society, and we consume. Of course we consume. I mean, human beings always had, they wouldn't survive if they hadn't. But the idea that maybe economies continue to grow and expand is something that needs to be reflected on. And perhaps the church, in its challenge to carbon zero, is well placed to begin to say, hang on a minute, is there a different model? I think there are people thinking about this and writing about it, as you know.
There are.
But maybe this is actually something that we need to have a voice in and not just expect always to have incremental increase, because maybe one of the questions we should ask is at what cost? Not just at what cost to the environment, but at what cost to others as well. And it brings us back to that sense of responsibility for others or with others, as well as our responsibility to the creation that we've been gifted, which is not ours to own.
And so, Simon, we talked about this before. We said, this all sounds fabulous and lovely and wonderful, and we're sort of saying that this desire for us to be carbon zero is reflected then in all our belief that God's given this to all of us. This is to be from generation to generation. This is to be for people across the planet, and we're sort of trying to right the wrongs in some ways. But we said, didn't we, it can sound a bit idealistic. It can be a bit like, okay, so I'm now sitting in my parish church. We've only got so much money. We've only got so much energy, literally energy, not just gas and electricity energy. We're into the realms now of Christian ethics, Christian practice. How do we marry this? So if what we're saying, one of the ways we're saying is that part of our worship is to live well together, how do we understand that when we can't reach some of these ideals?
I think that is the challenge that faces so many people, and those of us who are part of DACs will know that we get faculty applications from parishes which have got just one church warden, small congregation, ancient building. They're doing their best, they're expending their energy, they're probably, you know, in their 80s, and it's a hard road doing that and leading by example in a community that maybe doesn't take what the church is doing particularly seriously. So I think it is a very difficult thing. I think I want to answer it in two ways. The first one, I think, is actually the way in which we begin to do this needs to begin from the sense of generous God, because we can easily feel we're running out. That we're running out of everything. We're running out of energy. We're running out of money. We're running out of time. I mean, and some of those things will naturally be true, but that can lead to a sense that everything is scarce. And if we have a view that everything in the world is scarce, then what I think we naturally do as human beings, as flawed human beings, is we hold on to what we've got. We say, you can't have any of that because that's mine and I need it in order to continue. And I would like to have some more, please. And again, that feeds back into our sense of the imbalances of things. So I think one of the things which is really hard to do sometimes in a PCC or whatever, is actually to begin to get a sense of the generosity of God and our call to be generous people. That we live by generosity, we bless others by generosity, we are blessed by generosity. And so I think that, you know, that can sound very airy-fairy, but I think sometimes the basis on which we have a lot of our practical conversations is absolutely key. And I think the other thing I want to say is that let's be realistic. If we could, you know, be like angels, we could probably achieve this, you know, tomorrow, if not today.
I've got this
But we're
vision
not-
of you now with a halo.
I know, yes, wonderful, isn't it? But the point is, we're not. We are flawed human beings. We are called as we are to engage in all of this. We set ourselves challenges. General Synods set this challenge. Some of us might wish it hadn't. But the challenge is a godly challenge. And therefore, I think sometimes what we have to say is, in my context, with the people I have around me, we can do this.
Yeah.
And that's a first step.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll do another step. And then maybe we'll do another one. Because one of the most dispiriting things, I think, is to have an ideal set before you that you have no hope of achieving unless somebody can show you what the first steps are to take.
Yeah.
And I've always felt that one of the roles of a leader in the church, and I think many of us participating tonight are leaders, is actually to say, okay, that's the ideal, but let's take this step first. And let's not be anxious about the first step.
Yeah, and that's an interesting way to look at the stuff that Louise is going to do with us later, isn't it?
Yeah.
And about seeing some of this around this, about for those who aren't quite sure where to start, these are some of the rules and regulations we've got around this that will help us to begin to think about some of these issues. And it could be that these do set up, small Bible study groups, small prayer groups, things where we start to, because in one way there is an intensity about this. There is a we are reaching some crises points, but that is all within the idea of the context of God, the God who's holding us and loving us, and we need to keep being reminded of that. When we chatted, didn't we, Simon? It's a slight sort of off, but that idea that we feel that what we offer is just too small, too little, so perhaps we shouldn't bother, and perhaps God's very cross with us because we've made such a pickle of it all. And I talked about the fact that when my children were young, they were the ones who came home, from playgroup with all their little pictures and things, which you then put up on the fridge, and everybody else thinks they're dreadful and you think they're utterly beautiful, because there's something about love and intention behind it. And I often have this idea that God puts some of our stuff on God's fridge. That somehow the things that we talk about in PCC, the intention that we have, the fact that we are really trying in this, and sometimes with limited resources and limited knowledge and quite a lot of fear, that I think God takes that, and I think that is blessed. And I don't think that's just airy-fairy. I think these discussions we have and these attempts to sort out our boilers, they are our prayers and our worship of God, to say we're both repentance and intention to ask the Spirit to help us to do things differently. So it is that idea that these might look like really practical things, but they're rooted somehow in that belief that God loves us and we are trying to love God and the world and each other well. That's me bit.
I entirely agree with you, and I love the idea that God might be putting my contribution on his fridge, because along with all the other toddlers.
And don't worry, Russell. Don't worry, Russell. God's also got the canons of the Church of England also down there. Ticks them off.
I think one of the other things is worth saying, it's while we're talking about this kind of sense of Christian ethics, which is both a corporate thing and an individual thing, that there are many, many churches in this country who are looking around, are going to ask the question, what could we do with this building, with this group of people, to lower our carbon footprint? And the answer may be not very much as a group, because actually it's a tiny church, the heating's on not a lot. The church itself was built centuries ago, so its carbon footprint is pretty small now. And rather than get dispirited, I think what's been encouraging for me is conversations I've had with people who said, because we've had this discussion in church about what we could do together, I've been challenged to ask myself what I can do individually.
Yes.
How many times should I go on an aircraft during the year? How should I make choices about how I buy things or don't buy things? How should I make, if you like, my carbon footprint smaller as part of making the church's carbon footprint smaller? Now, for those individual choices and changes, you don't need a faculty. And I don't think General Synod is going to require us to do that. But that commitment in discipleship actually engenders a way of thinking about things in a broader sense, I think.
And just to say very briefly, you know, if people, you know, in PCCs and small groups, you know, there's quite a lot of stuff of eco-theology going on. Margot Hodgson, you know, Cudston has a course that she does. There's lots of stuff out there, but, you know, and if people do want to contact us, we can always, I can steer in the right direction of some of these things.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there for the moment because my doorbell has malfunctioned, as you can probably hear.
No, we didn't hear. We just noticed. We just noticed you put yourself on mute. I thought you'd fallen out with me, Simon.
I think if somebody leans, I'm just going to unplug it. If somebody leans on the button, it carries on forever.
I'm just sitting here now with nobody to talk to. But I reckon, Louise, I'm going to do a Simon here. Oh, and he's back.
Oh, we are back. Sorry.
Lovely. Thanks, Simon. I think you're going on to Louise, aren't you?
Yeah, I think we are in a moment. That was thank you for that conversation. Sorry about the interruptions. Anyway, I hope people have found that useful. Maybe it's stimulated some thoughts, things that you'd like to talk about in the breakout groups, and things to share. And we'd like you to carry on that conversation. We'd love you also to be able, through the breakout groups, to kind of share with us, because we're going to be spread around the groups as members of the committee, begin to kind of develop our understanding and our theology as we're taking some of this stuff ahead. Because when we rerun this one, as I think we're probably going to, we're probably going to have a slightly different theological conversation, but that'll be informed by all the rest of you as well as by what we've just had. So Andrea, thanks very much. And I think we're going to carry on with Louise, who's going to take us into the legal aspects of things, but with that understanding that this is very much part of the life of the people of God. It's there to facilitate us in what we are challenged and called to do. So Louise, I'm really grateful that you're here, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now. Oh, yes, here, sorry. There we are. I have done a short set of PowerPoint slides, really because I don't want to have to read every single detail out, and also because if people would like to follow some of the links or have some of the details set out for them, you can request those later on. We can send them to you. That'll be done centrally via the ELS team. So just starting off with the background, I am looking at this in the detail of the faculty jurisdiction rules. So I think from the very divine discussion we've just had, I'm bringing us all back down to earth with a bump. So the context, first of all, is the General Synod's resolution that has already been mentioned in the discussion. Resolution on climate change, which was passed at the February 2020 set of General Synod meetings, which gave a commitment to working towards net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And I've put the text of the resolution up on the screen for you so that you can see it. Notice that there is a reference to God's creation and the fundamental injustice. So this isn't just, you know, this does have the wider context that we've just been talking about. But I think the really important thing to notice about the General Synod resolution is that it is talking about carbon emissions. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. If you read anything about the General Synod debate on this, you'll know that originally the group that brought the resolution to General Synod was proposing net zero emissions by 2045, and very shortly into the course of the debate, somebody proposed that 2045 was too far away and we should be looking at 2030. Quite a significant reduction in the time period and the target but it was felt at the meeting that that was justified and that it was important to work really hard towards the 2030 target. So in the end, after a debate and a vote, 2030 is the year that we got. So obviously not very far away now. But you can see there that General Synod was calling upon all parts of the church. So we're looking at parishes, BMOs, education institutions. So of course, that's largely Church of England schools, dioceses, cathedrals, and the NCIs, the National Church institutions, to work to achieve that reduction year on year with an intention to reach net zero emissions by 2030, and that a plan should be put in place to achieve that target. So what we're looking at today is part of the plan that's being referred to. But as I said, it's really important to note that we're talking about carbon emissions here. So that is operational emissions in relation to the running of the church's activities. We're not talking about the wider issue of what we call transactional emissions. So if you think about perhaps building an extension on a church, the emissions created by the contractors travelling to the church, any power they use in building that extension, the materials that they're using. So perhaps they're using cheaper materials imported from China that have come halfway across the world, disposal of old materials, and then loss of carbon reduction capacity, such as felling trees in the churchyard in order to build the extension. None of those transactional emissions are included in the target that we're talking about. And nor in the target are we talking about things like transport costs of clergy, congregation members, employees, things like that. So those things that sit around the edge of our day-to-day operational emissions are not included. Although I will talk briefly about electronic charging points, but as I say, the manner in which the priest gets to church on a Sunday morning isn't part of our carbon emissions for the purposes of this resolution. So what I'm going to do, having looked at that particular resolution, is look in a bit more detail at the faculty jurisdiction and how, in the exercise of faculty jurisdiction, the new legislation is aiming to get us towards that near net zero emissions by 2030. So what happened was, in order the view was that what we needed to do essentially to start off with was to amend the faculty jurisdiction rules, which are the rules that help DACs and chancellors on a day-to-day basis make decisions on faculty applications. So a net zero carbon working group was set up, and the purpose of that group was to make recommendations to the Rule Committee of the General Synod, of which I am one of the members, to come up with some amendments to the faculty jurisdiction rules that would get us towards the net zero target. And as a result of all of that, what we had was some amendments to the faculty jurisdiction rules, which came in on the 1st of July this year. So the important point to note when I'm talking is that this legislation applies to new faculty applications or requests for advice that have come in from the 1st of July onwards. So anything that was started before that date won't be covered. As an aside, my vicar in one of our churches in our parish was talking about implementing a new gas boiler in quite a modern church. And I said to him, try and get the application in before the 1st of July, otherwise we're going to have a lot more work to do. And unfortunately, we didn't get it in, so he has had to do the extra work. But that is the point, that anybody making the application now is going to have to do this extra work that I'll be talking about. So the working group applied a number of principles, which were firstly the main overriding one was to encourage behaviour that would move churches towards the net zero carbon. Secondly, to make the permissions route more straightforward for proposals that are more likely to reduce carbon. So as you'll see as I talk through, this has been achieved to some extent by moving things from the requirement to go down the full faculty process, moving some items into lists A and list B, so it makes it easier for parishes to get on with some of the carbon reduction activities without having to go through the full faculty process. And then to increase the strength of the case needed for a parish that has a proposal that would commit them to producing additional carbon after 2030. So that's things like installing a new gas or oil boiler. So that is about putting extra hurdles in the way for things that are not going to get us to the 2030 deadline. And so that's more about shifting things that were in lists A and list B through to the full faculty jurisdiction, so they can be examined in more detail by the DAC and by the Chancellor. And so that's what the Working Party was looking towards. The legislation was introduced by the Dean of the Archers, Morag Ellis KC, who some of you may have heard her speaking about these issues. I think it was earlier this year, it may have been the end of last year, but she has spoken to the ELS before about this. But in she introduced the proposed legislation, and what she said was that the changes represented a positive and proportionate part of the Church's response to the climate emergency. And that was introduced at the February 2022 meeting, so earlier this year, and the legislation was passed by General Synod, and as I said, has now gone through the process and is now in place. So the first thing before we just look at lists A and B is a new requirement to have what we call due regard to the net zero guidance. So this is a fundamental change to the faculty jurisdiction rules. And for those of you who get involved in safeguarding, you may be familiar with the term having due regard, because in safeguarding legislation, there's a requirement for church officers and church bodies to have due regard to the House of Bishops' guidance on safeguarding. And the explanation of what due regard means is the same under the faculty jurisdiction rules as it is in relation to safeguarding and applying the House of Bishops' guidelines. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But the point is that you need to have due regard to net zero guidance when we've got something that is covered by the net zero guidance issued by the Church Buildings Commission. So the first question really, when we're looking at these issues, is the thing that a parish wants to do in its church or its buildings something that's covered by that net zero guidance? And in order to work that out, you need to go to the CBC website. I put the link there on the slide. And currently the guidance that has been issued by the CBC covers the following things. And I'll just go through the list, which you can find, as I say, on the website. There's an overriding document that they've produced called the Practical Path to Net Zero Carbon for Churches. They then have three different sets of guidance about heating. There's the one called the Heating Principles, one called the Heating Checklist, and one called Heating Options Appraisals. There's then a guidance note on electric vehicle charging, solar panels and faculty jurisdiction, biomass boilers, church lighting, so that's internal lighting, and then church flood lighting. So all of those things make up the matters to which net zero guidance applies. So if you're looking at dealing with one of those things, then this legislation, the requirement to have due regard, kicks in. So there's four different areas where we have to pay due regard. The first is where the applicants, so the parish, the church wardens, the vicar, have a list B proposal, which involves something to which the net guidance applies. If they're making, so the list B proposals are where the parish approaches the archdeacon and asks for the archdeacon to give list B approval. In those circumstances, the proposal from the parish must include an explanation of how the applicants have had due regard to the guidance. So whatever the relevant guidance is, they have to explain in their application how they've paid due regard. The second situation is when when a parish is consulting the DAC on proposed works. So they're going through a consultation with the DAC and they've got a proposal that they want the DAC to comment on. In those circumstances, again, that proposal must include an explanation of how they've paid due regard. The third situation is when the DAC gives its advice in the case of a faculty application to which the net zero guidance applies. The DAC's advice following the meeting must include a statement of whether the applicant's explanation is adequate, and if it isn't, the DAC's reasons for that opinion. And allied to that, so the other side of that coin is that where a parish is making a faculty application for something that's covered by the net zero guidance, again, they have to explain how they've had due regard to the guidance in formulating their proposals. So you'll see that there's a lot of emphasis placed on the people applying for the faculty or applying for the list B or applying for advice. Emphasis is on them putting together an explanation as to what they've done in relation to the advice given by the CBC in the particular area that they're applying for. And it's important to note that the DAC's advice must give their reasons if they don't think people have complied with that duty. The duty to have due regard only falls on the applicants for the faculty. So it falls on the parish, the church wardens and the rest. It's not imposed on the DAC. It's not imposed on the archdeacons, considering list B proposals. It's not imposed on the chancellor. It's for the parish to deal with the duty and to give their explanation as to what they've done. So what does due regard mean? What is the definition? And this is, as I say, similar to the safeguarding definition of the same term. So where the legislation imposes this duty, the person to whom the guidance is directed is not free to choose whether or not to follow the guidance. As a matter of law, the guidance should be given great weight and must be followed unless there are what we call cogent reasons for not doing so. And those cogent reasons are reasons that are clear, logical, and convincing. And what the explanations say is that cogent reasons are only likely to arise where the guidance doesn't contemplate a particular unusual situation, so that it becomes necessary for the applicants to take possibly a different approach to that set out in the guidance. Okay. Now it is worth noting that until the 1st of July, there was still an obligation on people to consider the CBC guidance. There is a footnote at the bottom of all CBC guidance documents that says that the guidance is issued under the Diocese Mission and Pastoral Measure. It's statutory guidance. It must be considered with great care. And the standards of good practice in the guidance shouldn't be departed from unless justified by clear, logical and convincing reasons. So it's not a huge difference between what was already in place in terms of having to follow CBC guidance. However, the difference now is that there is this statutory obligation to pay due regard to the guidance, and then that obligation follows through with the DAC having to consider it and including it in their decision before the matter goes to the Chancellor. So just moving on to look at the way in which the lists A and B in faculties work, it is now going to be easier to obtain permission for those different things listed on that slide. So draft proofing doors and windows is now put into list A. Okay, so as long as what you're doing complies with the requirements under list A, don't even need to go to the Archdeacon. Pipework insulation, list A. Replacement of lights with low energy light fittings can now be done under list B. New non-fossil fuel boilers can be done, new non-fossil fuel boilers can be done more easily, but a full faculty is now required for oil and gas. So currently, previously, just before the legislation changed, list A did allow you to do a like-for-like replacement of boilers, including oil and gas, but the oil and gas bits have now been removed. So if they're new non-fossil fuel boilers, you're okay under list A. Under list B, for anything that's fossil fuel, you now need to go to faculty. Roof insulation in non-listed buildings can now be done under list B, and introduction of soft furnishings also under list A, because putting in kneelers and cushions and things like that can make the room, the church warmer without having to have extra heating. Electric vehicle charging points can now be covered under list A or list B, depending on the location of the installation and the listing status of the building. So you need to read those rules very carefully, but it will now be much easier to introduce those into it, for example, into your church car park. Solar panels on unlisted buildings which are not in conservation areas can now be done under list B, but remember that in some areas you do need planning permission, and if the building's listed you can't go down the list B route. And then electric pew heaters, which is all about heating the people rather than the building, can now be done usually under list B, depending on the nature of the building. So as I mentioned, a faculty is now required for like replacement of fossil fuel boilers and replacement of oil tankers. Remember though that although you have to pay due regard to the CBC guidance, the CBC guidance doesn't prohibit fossil fuel boilers. What it does is takes you through the different things that ought to be considered when replacing a boiler, when replacing a heating system. And it does recognise that in some circumstances, it may be that the only sensible option is to go down the fossil fuel boiler route. So look at the guidance carefully. You are not prohibited from these things. It's just a question of making sure you've been through the list, and the document in particular called Church Heating Principles, it is the one to look at when you're going down the route of faculty applications for fossil fuel boilers. It's very carefully drafted, and it gives you lots of things to think about in a fairly straightforward explanation. So that's the most important one. But as I say, they're not prohibited. You've just got to go down the faculty route, and it'll be examined in more detail. So I'm just very briefly going to look at a few examples from case law that might help show you how some of these things may work in future. I have carried out some research to see if we've got any new case law on this area, and unfortunately there hasn't been any, unless something's been decided in the last few hours. I can't find any consistory court judgments dealing with the new legislation. It only came in on the 1st of July, of course. But what I have done is found some cases that have been decided since the General Synods overall decision on the net zero, and this has been taken into account by chancellors, so it might give us some ideas as to what their approach is going to be. So that first case about St Mark's Mitcham was a situation where the chancellor allowed the replacement of an existing gas-fueled heating system with a new gas boiler. And this was after, as I say, the General Synod had made its resolution. And what the Chancellor said was, he'd looked through the background to this, and the PCC had asked on several occasions during the course of its consideration of replacing the boiler whether there was a greener alternative. And as they went through it, the answer was always no. There was no sensible greener alternative that was actually going to achieve what they wanted to achieve in the church. And the Chancellor's view in this case was that as long as the petitioners had considered the implications of the proposal for the carbon neutral agenda, it was not appropriate for the Chancellor to substitute his own judgment of the matter. So his view was the parish had carefully considered the implications of the current proposal in relation to the carbon emissions, and they couldn't do anything other than install a new fossil fuel boiler, so he allowed it. The next case, the Dudley case, was quite an interesting one, because this was, again, before the new legislation came into place, but after the decision had been made by the General Synod. The application was to install 2 fossil fuel burning boilers to heat a church building. And the Chancellor said she was very troubled by the application and by the apparent lack of consideration of non-fossil fuel alternatives. She said in the case, I have seriously considered requiring the petitioners to undertake a thorough options appraisal before considering the petition, and or requiring them to obtain an expert report on the viable alternatives of heating that doesn't generate carbon emissions. She went on to say she decided against that because partly because the new legislation hadn't actually kicked in yet, and so it would be unfair on the parish, but also because she took the view that by putting certain requirements on the faculty, certain conditions, she could achieve some of the greener approach to what was being done. So she did allow, in this case, she did allow the boilers to be introduced, but she said, firstly, on condition that the gas supplied under a green tariff should be used where possible, and that the carbon emissions created by all non-renewable gas should be offset. She also said she didn't agree with the last case, the Mitcham case. It was her view that actually the Chancellor did need to be more proactive about achieving the net zero carbon emissions and shouldn't just rely on the considerations by the PCC, but the Chancellor should effectively be asking more questions. So it'll be interesting to see how Chancellors approach these things. Will the Chancellors be happy to say the PCC's considered it, so I'm okay with that? Or will they say, actually, I know the PCC's considered it, but I'm going to ask more questions and I might put more conditions on it. The Welling case was a case by the same Chancellor as the Mitcham case. And again, he took the view that the PCC had looked into all of the alternatives and he was comfortable with that. And he did say in his judgment, the choice is between having an efficient heating system or not having a heating system at all. And in that case, the PCC had considered all the alternatives and he allowed it to go ahead. And the last case, just very briefly, is the Door case, where the Chancellor said, the petitioner's proposals include a new underfloor heating system, and their present plan is that a new, more efficient gas boiler be installed. The new 2022 rules were enforced by the time of this decision, but had come in force after the faculty application had been made. And she said, although technically the rules don't apply to this long-standing matter, it is appropriate for the petitioners to review their proposals in this regard and have regard to net zero guidance and consider fully the alternatives. So the faculty didn't pass in that case. It was a faculty application for a variety of things, and the PCC were told to go off and consider the CBC guidance. So I know I've overrun slightly and I apologise for that. I just thought it was helpful to go through some of the case law. What we will see in the next few months, I expect, is some new consistory court decisions by chancellors looking at these issues. You will be able to see the sorts of approach that they're starting to take. But the most important thing is to remember that duty to have due regard, and for anybody dealing with these matters to go to the CBC website and read the guidance on the areas that they're particularly dealing with. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussions.
Louise, thank you very much indeed for all of that. I think very necessarily at the moment, most of the things that are making the judgments are actually to do with boilers and heating. That is probably one of the major things that it's going to carry on being. But I'm also quite intrigued by the lights question, but we'll leave that perhaps to discussion a little bit later on. I think now we're going to have a break.